What if the greatest secret hidden inside the oldest civilization on Earth isn't that the Anunnaki created humanity, but that the Anunnaki themselves were created by beings almost no one remembers? Not destroyed, not erased, simply forgotten. Tonight, we're traveling further back than kings, older than the first cities, beyond the gods themselves, into a story that begins before time had a name. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts below. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's journey to the beginning of beginnings. For more than a century, the Anunnaki have fascinated historians, archaeologists, writers, and millions of curious minds around the world. Depending on whom you ask, they were divine rulers, judges of humanity, cosmic engineers, or visitors from another world. Entire books, documentaries, and endless online discussions revolve around their supposed connection to the origins of civilization. Yet almost every one of those discussions begins in exactly the same place, with the Anunnaki. Almost none ask the question that naturally comes before it. Where did they come from? Because if every civilization tells us that nothing simply appears without a beginning, why should the Anunnaki be any different? The oldest surviving texts from ancient Mesopotamia never describe them as eternal creators of everything. They occupy positions within a much larger cosmic order. They inherit authority. They receive responsibilities. They participate in councils. They obey laws older than themselves. That small detail changes everything. To understand why, we must leave behind the popular versions of the story. Forget, for a moment, giant astronauts descending from distant planets. Forget impossible technologies. Forget modern speculation. Instead, imagine southern Mesopotamia nearly 5,000 years ago. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates flooded every year, covering enormous plains with fertile soil. Villages gradually transformed into cities unlike anything humanity had seen before. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur. Massive temple complexes rose above the flat landscape. Thousands of people worked together, traded together, prayed together, and perhaps most importantly, wrote. The invention of writing did not begin with epic stories. It began with accounting. Clay tablets recorded barley deliveries, livestock, beer rations, workers, taxes, and grain storage. Only later did those same symbols become capable of preserving myths, prayers, royal histories, and philosophical ideas that would survive thousands of years beneath layers of sand. Those tablets became time capsules. Unlike papyrus or parchment, baked clay could survive fires that destroyed entire cities. Ironically, the disasters that ended ancient kingdoms also preserved their memories. When archaeologists uncovered libraries buried beneath collapsed palaces during the 19th century, they discovered tens of thousands of tablets waiting silently beneath the earth. Many spoke of kings. Others spoke of floods. Some described rituals, and among them appeared a mysterious collective name, the Anunnaki. But the earliest references are surprisingly restrained. The texts do not introduce them with dramatic entrances or cosmic battles. Instead, they often appear as an established assembly of divine beings whose existence is already assumed. It is almost as if the original audience already knew a much older story. Imagine opening a novel halfway through. Characters speak confidently about events you've never witnessed. Names are mentioned without explanation. Relationships are taken for granted. That is exactly how many ancient Mesopotamian texts treat the Anunnaki, which suggests something remarkable. Their true beginning belonged to traditions even older than many surviving tablets. To uncover that forgotten beginning, scholars compare myths copied across different centuries, different cities, and even different empires. Each version preserves tiny fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror. One city emphasizes one ancestor. Another preserves an older genealogy. A third quietly changes names while keeping the same structure beneath. Slowly, a pattern begins to emerge. The Anunnaki were never presented as the first existence. Above them stood older generations, older powers, older principles. Some were not even described as individuals in the way later gods were. They represented concepts that existed before mountains, before stars, before light itself. This idea may sound unusual today. Yet ancient civilizations repeatedly imagined creation not as a single moment, but as a long succession of generations. Each generation gave birth to another. Each inherited both power and limitation. Each moved one step farther from the original mystery. That pattern appears not only in Mesopotamia, but echoes across many of humanity's oldest traditions. And perhaps that is why one question refused to disappear. If the Anunnaki were born, who or what existed before them? To answer that question, we must travel to a time before the first temples, before the first kings claimed divine authority, before even the oldest remembered gods had names. Because the story of the Anunnaki does not begin with the Anunnaki. It begins in a darkness so ancient that even the gods would later struggle to describe it. Long before the names Anu, Enlil, Enki, or the Anunnaki ever appeared on clay tablets, the people of ancient Mesopotamia imagined a universe unlike anything we picture today. There were no stars suspended across an endless vacuum, no spinning planets, no galaxies stretching beyond imagination. To the earliest storytellers, existence began as something far stranger, a limitless expanse where nothing yet possessed form, direction, or purpose. The oldest surviving traditions never describe creation as an explosion or an instant act of divine will. Instead, they speak of emergence. Order slowly separated itself from disorder, just as islands appear from retreating floodwaters or reeds rise from marshes after the river begins to fall. This gradual unfolding became one of the defining ideas of Mesopotamian cosmology. The universe was not built in a single day. It awakened. One of the earliest sacred cities, Eridu, claimed to be the first city established after creation itself. To its priests, civilization did not begin with humanity. It began when divine order descended into an otherwise chaotic world. Long before kings ruled from palaces, the gods themselves were believed to establish sacred places where the structure of existence could take shape. But even those earliest gods had ancestors. The names most often associated with the beginning are Apsu and Tiamat. Modern books frequently describe them as gods of fresh water and salt water. But that translation barely hints at their deeper meaning. Water, for the Mesopotamians, represented potential. Before fields could grow grain, before bricks could be molded into temples, before people could survive, there had to be water. It was both life and mystery. Rivers created prosperity, yet floods destroyed entire settlements. Water could nourish or erase. So when ancient scribes imagined the beginning of everything, they did not begin with solid ground. They began with endless waters. Apsu represented the deep fresh water beneath the earth, hidden and silent. Tiamat embodied the vast, restless salt sea that surrounded the known world. Neither was described as a creator in the familiar sense. Instead, together they formed the primordial condition from which later generations emerged. Notice the subtle difference. The earliest myths are less interested in explaining who built the universe than in describing how existence slowly differentiated itself. From unity came distinction. From stillness came movement. From possibility came identity. The younger divine generations gradually appeared, each representing another layer of organization within the cosmos. This genealogy would eventually lead toward figures like Anu, the sky, Enlil, associated with authority and the atmosphere, and Enki, connected with wisdom, craftsmanship, and the life-giving waters. Only much later do we begin encountering the collective known as the Anunnaki. That sequence matters enormously, because it places the Anunnaki several generations removed from the beginning itself. In popular culture, the Anunnaki often occupy the highest position imaginable. Ancient Mesopotamian texts tell a different story. They belong to an already established divine family. Even more intriguing is the fact that different cities preserve slightly different versions of this family tree. Nippur elevated Enlil. Eridu emphasized Enki. Ur favored the moon god Nana. Uruk celebrated Inanna. Every great temple naturally highlighted its own patron deity. Yet despite these differences, the deeper framework remained surprisingly consistent. The universe possessed history. Even the gods inherited their places. Power flowed through generations rather than appearing fully formed. This idea distinguished Mesopotamian religion from many modern assumptions about absolute beginnings. Nothing existed in complete isolation. Everything belonged to a lineage. Scholars have spent decades comparing these overlapping traditions, discovering that many apparent contradictions actually preserve different stages of extremely old beliefs. Rather than replacing older stories, new myths often layered themselves upon ancient foundations, allowing traces of forgotten traditions to survive beneath newer narratives. Imagine repainting the same wall every century. Eventually, the newest layer dominates what everyone sees. But underneath remain older colors, invisible, until careful restoration begins. Ancient mythology works much the same way. Every empire inherited stories from those that came before. The Akkadians borrowed from the Sumerians. The Babylonians reworked older Akkadian traditions. The Assyrians copied Babylonian texts while adding their own interpretations. As each civilization reshaped the past, fragments of much older beliefs remained embedded inside later writings. Sometimes a single phrase reveals that an older version once existed. Sometimes an unusual title preserves the memory of a forgotten deity. Sometimes an entire genealogy quietly survives beneath a rewritten myth. This is why historians rarely rely on one tablet alone. Instead, they reconstruct enormous puzzles from thousands of damaged fragments scattered across museums around the world. A broken line from Nineveh may complete a sentence found at Nippur. A fragment discovered at Sippar may preserve a name missing from Babylonian copies. Piece by piece, a deeper picture emerges. And that picture contains a surprising realization. The Anunnaki were never intended to stand at the summit of existence. They were powerful. They were ancient. They governed aspects of the cosmos, and in many traditions, participated in determining the destinies of gods and humans alike. But above every council stands an older foundation. Behind every genealogy, lies an earlier beginning. And if we continue following that chain backward, we eventually reach a figure whose very name simply means sky. Not the sky we see above us, something far older than that. If we continue moving backward through the oldest Mesopotamian traditions, one name begins to appear with remarkable consistency: Anu. Today, Anu is usually introduced with a single sentence: the god of the sky. But that simple description hides one of the most profound concepts in ancient religion. To the people of Sumer, sky did not merely mean the blue dome above their heads. It represented the highest imaginable order, the invisible realm beyond everything humanity could touch, the place from which authority itself descended. That is why ancient kings repeatedly claimed that their right to rule came from Anu. They were not simply asking for divine approval. They were connecting themselves to the very source of cosmic legitimacy. Yet even Anu presents us with another mystery, because Anu also has parents. If the supreme heavenly ruler inherited existence, then someone or something must have preceded him. The deeper scholars examine ancient genealogies, the more extraordinary the picture becomes. According to some of the oldest Sumerian traditions, before Anu there existed two primordial beings whose names appear almost deceptively simple: Anunnaki. Modern translations usually render these as heaven and earth, but once again, literal translation misses the philosophical depth hidden inside the original concepts. These were not simply locations. They were principles. Imagine trying to explain the idea of space or matter to someone using only one word. Ancient languages often compressed enormous ideas into names. En represented the upper, transcendent realm. Ki represented the fertile, generative foundation from which life could emerge. Together, they formed one of the earliest cosmic pairings in recorded history. At first, they were not separated. Many Mesopotamian creation traditions describe heaven and earth as once existing together in a single unified condition. Only later were they divided. That separation created the world. Mountains gained height. The atmosphere appeared between above and below. Light acquired direction. Living creatures finally had room to exist. Notice how different this feels from modern scientific language. Ancient people explained reality through relationships rather than mechanisms. Creation happened because fundamental principles became distinct, not because machines began operating. This idea would later echo across countless civilizations. The Greeks spoke of Uranus and Gaia. The Egyptians described Nut arching over Geb. Several Indo-European traditions preserved similar images of heaven and earth once joined before being separated. Were these cultures borrowing from one another? Sometimes, sometimes not. Human beings across great distances often arrived at remarkably similar symbolic explanations for the same overwhelming mystery. Why is there something instead of nothing? Why are heaven and earth separate? Why does order exist at all? Mesopotamia offered one answer. Order required division. Without separation, nothing possessed identity. But here, another fascinating detail quietly emerges. The oldest Sumerian texts rarely portray An as an active ruler constantly intervening in earthly affairs. Instead, he often remains distant, almost beyond human reach. His authority is unquestioned, yet his direct involvement appears surprisingly limited. Responsibility gradually shifts downward. Enlil governs, Enki advises, Inanna acts. The Anunnaki assemble. The universe becomes increasingly populated by divine administrators. It almost resembles a great kingdom. At its summit stands a sovereign whose presence legitimizes everything below, while countless officials carry out the daily work of maintaining cosmic order. This hierarchical structure would influence political thinking for thousands of years. Earthly kings modeled themselves after heaven. Just as the divine world possessed councils, judges, and appointed authorities, human kingdoms developed similar institutions. Religion and government reflected one another. But once we recognize this hierarchy, another question becomes unavoidable. Who established it? Who determined that An should occupy the highest position? Surprisingly, the oldest myths offer no dramatic coronation, no cosmic election, no war placing him upon a throne. Instead, his authority appears almost natural, as though the universe itself acknowledged it. Yet even that explanation leaves unanswered one final question. Where did An himself originate? Some scholars believe the answer may lie in traditions even older than written history. Remember, writing appeared relatively late. Modern humans had already existed for tens of thousands of years before the first clay tablets were impressed with reed styluses. Stories were spoken around fires for countless generations before anyone attempted to preserve them permanently. By the time scribes finally recorded these myths, the traditions they copied may already have been ancient, perhaps unimaginably ancient. That possibility forces historians to remain cautious. The oldest surviving tablet is not necessarily the oldest version of the story. It is merely the oldest copy that happened to survive. This distinction changes everything. Imagine discovering a printed copy of a book from the year 1800. The copy itself dates to 1800. The story inside might be 1,000 years older. Mesopotamian myths work in exactly the same way. A Babylonian scribe copying a text in 700 BC might faithfully preserve ideas first spoken 2,000 years earlier, or perhaps even earlier still. That realization humbles every researcher. No one can say with certainty how deep these traditions truly extend. But as archaeologists uncovered increasingly older settlements beneath Mesopotamian cities, another astonishing pattern appeared. Every generation seemed to inherit sacred ideas from an even older civilization buried beneath it. Ur rested upon earlier settlements. Uruk concealed older occupation layers. Eridu revealed nearly continuous development stretching back toward the dawn of organized society. With every excavation, history grew deeper. The farther archaeologists dug into the earth, the farther historians were forced to push back the beginnings of civilization itself. And beneath the first cities, some believe there may have existed memories of a world that even the Sumerians considered ancient. For generations, archaeologists believed that the story of civilization began with the Sumerians. Their cities were older than the pyramids of Egypt. Their writing was the earliest known system ever discovered. Their temples dominated the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia long before the rise of Babylon or Assyria. It seemed like the beginning, until researchers started digging deeper, literally. Again and again, beneath the foundations of famous Sumerian cities, older layers of settlement emerged. Each layer represented people who had lived there centuries before the construction of the temples whose ruins still stand today. Uruk was built upon earlier villages. Ur concealed forgotten communities. Even Eridu, often called the oldest city in Mesopotamian tradition, revealed evidence of occupation stretching back thousands of years before the great dynasties. Civilization, it turned out, did not suddenly appear. It accumulated. Every generation inherited something from the one before it. The same appears to be true for mythology. When historians compare the earliest Sumerian texts with later Akkadian and Babylonian versions, they notice a fascinating pattern. The oldest stories are often the simplest. As centuries passed, those stories became richer, longer, and more elaborate. New gods entered the narrative. Older gods changed roles. Entire episodes were rewritten to reflect changing political realities. Religion evolved just as kingdoms did. One of the clearest examples is the famous Babylonian creation epic, known today as the Enuma Elish. Many people assume it represents the oldest Mesopotamian account of creation. It does not. In reality, it was composed much later, probably during the early 2nd millennium BC, long after many Sumerian traditions already existed. The Enuma Elish reflects Babylon's rise to power. Accordingly, it elevates Babylon's patron god, Marduk, above nearly every other deity. This was not merely theology. It was politics written into mythology. As Babylon became the dominant empire, its chief god became the dominant god as well. Earlier traditions were not erased. They were reorganized. Imagine if every new empire rewrote the world's history books so that its own capital became the center of everything. That is essentially what happened repeatedly across the ancient Near East. Yet despite these changes, traces of older beliefs remained visible beneath the surface, like fossils preserved inside younger rock. One of those surviving traces concerns the Anunnaki. Popular culture often imagines them as a single race of powerful beings with one unified purpose. The ancient texts paint a much more complicated picture. The word itself appears in different contexts across different centuries. Sometimes the Anunnaki function as great gods associated with heaven. Sometimes they appear as judges connected with the underworld. Elsewhere, they simply describe a divine assembly participating in decisions that shape both gods and humans. Their exact number also changes. Some texts imply dozens. Others mention only a handful. This inconsistency puzzled scholars for years. But perhaps the problem lies in our expectations. We often search ancient myths for precise systems. The people who created those myths were usually more interested in symbolism than consistency. To them, divine councils resembled human councils. Membership could vary. Authority could shift. Different cities naturally emphasized different participants. The important idea was not arithmetic. It was order. The universe operated because responsibilities were distributed. No single deity managed every aspect of existence alone. This distributed model makes Mesopotamian religion surprisingly sophisticated. Rain belonged to one sphere, wisdom to another, the heavens to another, the underworld to yet another. Instead of imagining unlimited power concentrated in one being, the Mesopotamians imagined a cosmos sustained through cooperation, hierarchy, negotiation, and occasionally conflict. That vision feels remarkably political, perhaps because their own cities functioned the same way. Priests, kings, administrators, craftsmen, farmers, each performed different roles. The universe reflected society. Society reflected the universe. Yet among all these divine offices, one group repeatedly appears whenever decisions of cosmic importance must be made. The Anunnaki, not as creators, not as the first beings, but as participants in an older system whose origins already stretched beyond memory. Some texts even suggest that they received their authority rather than inventing it themselves. That tiny detail often escapes modern readers. Receiving authority implies someone had the ability to grant it. Who possessed that authority? The obvious answer would seem to be Anu. And indeed, many texts describe Anu as the source from whom divine offices ultimately descend. But even this explanation leaves unanswered one deeper mystery. Why Anu? What made him supreme? The surviving tablets rarely explain. Instead, they treat his position as something already established before the stories begin. It is as though the audience required no explanation. Everyone already knew. That silence has become one of the greatest challenges facing modern historians. The oldest written records are not necessarily origin stories. Many begin in the middle of traditions that had already existed for centuries through oral storytelling. Imagine walking into the final chapters of an enormous novel whose opening pages have been lost forever. Characters reference ancient events, old alliances, forgotten generations. None are explained because the original audience never needed explanations. We do. And so scholars continue reconstructing those missing chapters from scattered clues. Broken tablets, damaged inscriptions, temple hymns, king lists, and fragments copied by scribes separated by hundreds of years. Each discovery adds another small piece to the puzzle, and gradually, another possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps the oldest mystery was never hidden inside the names of the Anunnaki themselves. Perhaps it was hidden inside the question they never bothered to answer. Because, for them, the beings who came before the Anunnaki may have been so ancient that no explanation seemed necessary at all. The deeper we travel into Mesopotamian history, the more one realization begins to reshape everything we thought we knew. The oldest clay tablets never described the Anunnaki as the architects of humanity. They never call them visitors from another planet. They never mention advanced machines, spaceships, or distant worlds orbiting an unseen star. Those ideas belong to much later interpretations. The actual texts tell a different story, a far quieter story, a story that is, in many ways, even more fascinating. One of the greatest challenges in studying ancient Mesopotamia is that no single tablet contains the entire picture. Instead, thousands of damaged fragments are scattered across museums in London, Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, Baghdad, Philadelphia, and dozens of other collections around the world. Many are broken into pieces no larger than a human hand. Entire sentences disappear where corners have crumbled away. Sometimes only a few surviving signs remain, forcing scholars to compare dozens of copies before reconstructing a single line. Imagine trying to understand an entire novel after discovering only scattered pages, with many of those pages burned around the edges. That is the reality of Assyriology. Every translation is the result of careful comparison, linguistic analysis, archaeology, and decades of collaborative work. When researchers place these fragments side by side, a remarkable consistency begins to emerge. The Anunnaki appear repeatedly, but their role is surprisingly administrative. They participate in councils, they witness decisions, they assign destinies, they oversee aspects of divine order. In several texts, they function almost like a celestial assembly, rather than an all-powerful race of creators. This becomes especially clear in myths concerning the organization of the universe. The cosmos is portrayed almost as a carefully governed kingdom. Different divine beings receive different responsibilities. Some oversee rivers, others regulate storms, some guard sacred laws, others maintain fertility or wisdom. Authority flows downward through an established hierarchy. Nothing suggests absolute independence. Even powerful gods operate within an existing structure. This idea reaches one of its clearest expressions in Mesopotamian concepts of destiny. The Sumerians believed that every part of creation possessed an appointed function. Kings ruled because destiny allowed them to rule. Cities flourished because divine order supported them. Even gods themselves acted according to roles established within the cosmic framework. One of the most intriguing symbols connected with this idea is the mysterious me. Modern translations often struggle to capture its meaning. The me were not objects in the ordinary sense, nor were they simply laws. Instead, they represented the fundamental principles that made civilization possible. Kingship, justice, music, writing, craftsmanship, wisdom, priesthood, truth. Even emotions and social institutions could exist because their corresponding me existed. Without them, reality itself would lose its structure. According to one famous Sumerian myth, these divine principles were carefully preserved by Enki before eventually passing into the hands of Inanna. The story is often humorous on the surface, involving feasting and clever deception. Yet beneath its playful tone lies an extraordinary philosophical idea. Civilization is not invented by humans. It is inherited. Order already exists. People merely receive it. This concept changes how we understand the Anunnaki. Rather than inventing existence, they participate in preserving an older cosmic order that already governs everything. They become guardians rather than absolute creators. That distinction may seem subtle. It is not. If someone preserves a library, they did not necessarily write every book inside it. If someone administers a kingdom, they did not necessarily build the kingdom. Likewise, the Anunnaki often appear less as architects of reality than as caretakers of a structure whose foundations reach further back than the surviving myths themselves. This observation has become increasingly important in modern scholarship because it highlights how easily later interpretations can overshadow earlier evidence. During the 20th century, several popular writers proposed that Mesopotamian myths described literal extraterrestrial visitors who engineered humanity. These ideas attracted enormous public attention. Books sold in the millions. Television documentaries repeated them. The internet amplified them even further. Yet specialists who spend their careers translating cuneiform tablets generally point out that these conclusions extend far beyond what the original texts actually say. The tablets certainly describe extraordinary beings. They certainly speak of divine knowledge descending from heaven. They certainly present the Anunnaki as immensely powerful. But the surviving inscriptions themselves remain theological and symbolic rather than technological. For the ancient scribes, the greatest mysteries were never engines or machines. They were order, justice, creation, mortality, the relationship between heaven and earth, the place of humanity within an immense and mysterious cosmos. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate after thousands of years. They ask questions that science alone cannot answer. Where did order come from? Why does existence possess structure? Why do civilizations rise and fall? Why do humans instinctively search for meaning beyond themselves? As the tablets continue revealing their fragmented voices across millennia, one conclusion grows increasingly difficult to ignore. The Anunnaki were not standing at the beginning of the story. They were already living inside one, a story inherited from generations of gods before them. And if those earlier generations also inherited their place, then perhaps the true origin of everything lies even deeper than the oldest surviving myth, hidden not in what the tablets say, but in what they quietly assume has always existed. By now, one conclusion has become difficult to escape. Every time we believe we have reached the beginning, another layer appears beneath it. The Anunnaki point toward Anu. Anu points toward older generations. Those generations point toward primordial forces that existed before recognizable gods. But eventually, we encounter a mystery that even the ancient Mesopotamians struggled to describe. What existed before heaven itself? For modern readers, this question feels almost impossible to imagine. We instinctively picture empty space, an endless universe waiting to be filled with stars. The ancient world imagined something entirely different. To the earliest Mesopotamian thinkers, heaven was not empty space. Heaven was structure. It was the invisible framework that allowed reality to exist in an orderly way. Without heaven, there was no above. Without earth, there was no below. Without the separation between them, direction itself had no meaning. This is why the earliest creation stories repeatedly describe the act of separation rather than construction. Before separation, everything existed together in an undifferentiated state. There was no horizon, no mountains, no rivers, no sunrise, no seasons. Even time itself becomes difficult to define because nothing changes. Ancient priests rarely attempted to explain this condition in precise language. Instead, they relied on symbols. Dark waters, infinite silence, hidden depths. These images appear again and again because ordinary language simply could not describe existence before existence. One of the most remarkable aspects of Sumerian thought is its willingness to accept mystery, unlike many later philosophical systems that attempt to explain every step of creation. The oldest Mesopotamian traditions often stop at a certain point. They acknowledge beginnings, but they do not always explain the beginning behind those beginnings. This silence has fascinated historians for generations. Was it intentional? Had earlier stories already been forgotten? Or did the priests themselves believe that some questions could never be answered? We cannot know. Yet the pattern appears repeatedly. Whenever the narrative approaches the absolute origin, certainty begins to dissolve. Names become symbols. Genealogies become less precise. Events blur into poetic images. It is almost as though language itself reaches its limit. Perhaps this explains why ancient temples focused less on explaining the first instant of creation and more on maintaining the order that already existed. For the Sumerians, preserving harmony mattered more than solving every cosmic mystery. Their festivals renewed divine order. Their rituals reaffirmed the balance between heaven, earth, rivers, kings, temples, and ordinary people. Creation was not viewed as something locked safely in the distant past. It was an ongoing condition that required constant maintenance. Every sunrise represented another victory over chaos. Every successful harvest confirmed that the cosmic balance still endured. Every king had the responsibility to uphold that balance. Failure invited disorder. This way of thinking shaped nearly every aspect of Mesopotamian life. Floods were not merely natural disasters. They reflected cosmic imbalance. Drought carried spiritual meaning. Political collapse mirrored heavenly disorder. The universe was understood as one interconnected system where divine, natural, and human realms constantly influenced one another. The Anunnaki occupied an important place within that system, but they were not outside it. Even they served the greater order. This becomes especially interesting when we examine another ancient concept known as the tablets of destiny. These mysterious objects appear in several Mesopotamian myths. Popular imagination often treats them like magical artifacts capable of granting unlimited power. The original text suggests something more subtle. Whoever possessed the tablets of destiny held legitimate authority over cosmic order. Notice the wording: not unlimited strength, not absolute creation. Authority, legitimacy. The tablets represented the right to govern according to the established structure of the universe. That distinction is crucial. Power alone was never enough. It had to be recognized by the deeper order of existence. Even mighty gods fought to obtain that recognition. In some myths, divine conflicts revolve around possession of these sacred tablets, not because they function like supernatural weapons, but because they symbolize lawful sovereignty over the cosmos itself. Again, we encounter the same philosophical pattern. Authority always comes from somewhere older. It is received, inherited, entrusted, never created from nothing. This recurring idea forces us to reconsider everything we've learned so far. Perhaps the greatest beings in Mesopotamian religion were not those who possessed the most power. Perhaps they were those who stood closest to the original source of order. But what exactly was that source? The surviving tablets never give a single answer. Instead, they leave behind scattered hints that later civilizations would reinterpret in remarkably different ways. The Egyptians spoke of the primeval mound rising from the waters. Greek poets imagined chaos preceding the Titans and Olympians. The ancient Hebrews opened their sacred writings with a world described as formless and void. Across thousands of years and thousands of miles, different cultures preserved an astonishingly similar intuition. Before creation, there was not simply nothing. There existed a state beyond ordinary description, a reality so ancient that even the oldest gods belong to what came after it. And perhaps that is why the earliest Mesopotamian scribes never tried to place the Anunnaki at the absolute beginning. To them, that place belonged to something far older, something that could not easily be given a face, or even a name. By the time the great civilizations of the ancient world began recording their own creation stories, something extraordinary had already happened. Although separated by deserts, mountains, and thousands of kilometers, many cultures preserved remarkably similar memories about the earliest age of existence. Not identical stories, not identical gods, but strikingly similar patterns. The further we move back toward the beginning, the fewer human qualities the gods possess. Instead of kings, warriors, or judges, we encounter forces, principles, conditions, states of existence. It is as if humanity's oldest memories were trying to describe something beyond ordinary experience. Mesopotamia was not alone. In ancient Egypt, creation began with the endless waters of Nun. Before the first sunrise, before the pyramids, before even the gods themselves, there existed only an infinite, silent ocean without direction or form. Then, according to several Egyptian traditions, the first mound emerged from those waters, just as dry land appeared after the annual flooding of the Nile. Only then could creation truly begin. Notice the similarity. The Mesopotamians also imagined waters before creation, not because they copied Egypt directly, but because water represented limitless potential. For civilizations whose entire existence depended upon rivers, water naturally became the symbol of beginnings. Travel farther east. The oldest Vedic traditions of India also describe creation emerging from an undefined state beyond ordinary understanding. Some hymns even admit complete uncertainty. One famous passage from the Nasadya Sukta asks whether anyone, even the highest divine beings, actually knows how creation began. Perhaps no one knows. Perhaps even the Creator came afterward. For a text written more than 3,000 years ago, the humility is astonishing. Rather than pretending certainty, it embraces mystery. The Greeks, centuries later, told another version. Before the Olympian gods, before Zeus, before the Titans, there was chaos. Today, the word chaos usually suggests disorder. To early Greek poets, however, chaos meant something closer to a yawning gap, an immeasurable opening from which later reality gradually unfolded. Again, creation begins not with familiar gods, but with something impossible to picture. Even in the Hebrew book of Genesis, the opening verses describe the earth as formless and void, with darkness covering the deep while the divine spirit moved over the waters. Different language, different theology. Yet once again, we encounter darkness. Depth, water. Potential before structure. Were all these cultures preserving memories of the same ancient tradition? That question has fascinated scholars for generations. The answer is probably more complex than either complete agreement or complete independence. Ideas traveled. Trade routes connected civilizations long before empires united them. Merchants carried stories alongside copper, tin, lapis lazuli, cedar wood, and precious stones. Priests encountered foreign temples. Kings exchanged gifts and diplomatic letters. Concepts crossed borders just as easily as caravans. Yet influence alone cannot explain everything. Human beings everywhere looked upon the same sky, experienced the same storms, watched rivers flood, saw seeds disappear beneath the earth before returning as green shoots. Nature itself taught powerful lessons about death, rebirth, order, and transformation. Perhaps this is why similar patterns emerged repeatedly across distant civilizations. Not because everyone copied one source, but because everyone confronted the same profound questions. Where did everything come from? Why does order emerge from disorder? Why does life continually return after apparent destruction? Mesopotamia offered one of humanity's earliest surviving answers. The universe unfolded through generations. Each generation inherited existence from an earlier one. Nothing stood completely alone. Everything belonged to a lineage reaching backward toward an origin that gradually disappeared into mystery. This perspective also explains why the Anunnaki rarely appear as isolated individuals. They belong to families, councils, genealogies, responsibilities. Relationships define them more than raw power. Modern audiences sometimes expect ancient myths to describe superheroes possessing unlimited abilities. The original stories rarely work that way. Even the greatest gods negotiate, debate, disagree, seek advice. Sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they fear consequences. In several Mesopotamian myths, divine assemblies gather to discuss problems affecting both heaven and earth. Decisions are reached collectively. Destinies are assigned after deliberation. This vision of the cosmos feels surprisingly human, perhaps intentionally so. Ancient societies often understood their governments as reflections of heaven. If kings consulted councils, the gods did likewise. If cities required administration, so did the universe. But there is another detail that becomes increasingly important as we compare civilizations. The oldest beings almost never resemble humans. Later, gods possess faces, personalities, marriages, rivalries, ambitions. The earliest realities do not. Primordial waters, infinite darkness, boundless ski the deep, the void, silence. These are not characters, they are conditions. Almost as though the farther humanity looked back, the less personal creation became. Only later did abstract principles gradually transform into familiar divine figures capable of speaking, ruling, and interacting with the world. This progression may reveal something profound about the evolution of religious thought itself. People first struggled to explain existence through symbols. Later generations transformed those symbols into stories. Stories became myths. Myths became theology. Theology became tradition. Across thousands of years, every civilization added another layer. By the time the surviving clay tablets were copied in Babylon or Nineveh, the oldest memories had already passed through countless generations of priests, storytellers, and scribes. Some details changed, others disappeared. Yet one quiet idea endured beneath them all. The greatest mystery was never the gods themselves. It was the reality that existed before any god could speak, before any heaven could stretch above the earth, before even the oldest names remembered by humanity had entered the story at all. For centuries, the greatest obstacle to understanding the origins of the Anunnaki was not a lack of curiosity. It was a lack of evidence. Ancient Mesopotamia does not preserve a single perfect library where every tablet survived untouched. Instead, history arrived in fragments. Entire cities vanished beneath layers of mud brick. Palaces collapsed into their own archives. Floods scattered collections. Fires baked some tablets hard enough to survive for millennia, while reducing others to dust. Even today, thousands of cuneiform tablets remain untranslated. Some sit quietly inside museum collections, carefully catalogued but never fully studied. Others remain inside storage drawers, waiting for specialists with the time, funding, and expertise to examine them. Still more almost certainly remain buried beneath the sands of modern Iraq, Syria, and southeastern Turkey. Every archaeological season carries the possibility that another missing piece of humanity's oldest story will emerge from the ground. This is one reason historians remain cautious. Our understanding of Mesopotamian religion is not frozen. It continues to evolve. A single newly translated tablet can completely change how scholars interpret an ancient myth. That has happened before, and it will almost certainly happen again. One fascinating example involves the city of Ebla, located in what is now northern Syria. When archaeologists uncovered its royal archives during the 1970s, they discovered more than 17,000 clay tablets. Many contained administrative records. Others preserved diplomatic correspondence. Some recorded religious traditions previously unknown to modern scholarship. Suddenly, historians gained access to voices that had remained silent for over 4,000 years. The discovery reminded the academic world of an important lesson. History is never finished. Every excavation has the potential to rewrite it. The same is true at Hattusa, the ancient capital of the Hittites. Thousands of tablets copied from Mesopotamian originals reveal how myths traveled across civilizations. Sometimes entire stories were translated into different languages. Sometimes foreign gods were identified with local deities. Ideas crossed political borders far more easily than armies ever could. This movement of ideas explains why echoes of Mesopotamian cosmology appear throughout the ancient Near East. But it also reveals something equally important. Stories change as they travel. No civilization preserved ancient traditions exactly as it received them. Every generation interpreted the past through its own beliefs. Babylon emphasized Marduk. Assyria elevated Ashur. The Hittites blended local traditions with imported myths. Even within Mesopotamia itself, priests in different cities preserved different versions of the same events. Modern historians therefore speak less about discovering the original myth and more about reconstructing families of traditions. Each version preserves something valuable. None preserves everything. This gradual accumulation of evidence has also changed the way researchers think about religion itself. Early scholars often searched for a single master narrative. Today, many recognize that ancient belief systems were far more fluid. Different temples could celebrate different versions without seeing them as contradictory. Mythology functioned less like a fixed textbook and more like an ongoing conversation spanning centuries. Within that conversation, the Anunnaki occupied many roles. They governed, they judged, they witnessed sacred decisions. They represented continuity between generations of divine authority. Yet nowhere do they clearly claim to stand outside the cosmic order itself. Instead, they belong to it. That realization quietly dismantles one of the most common modern assumptions. The oldest Mesopotamian religion was never centered on the idea of unlimited individual power. Its deepest concern was balance. Every force possessed a place. Every being fulfilled a role. Even conflict ultimately served the restoration of order. This perspective appears repeatedly in rituals, hymns, royal inscriptions, and temple liturgies. Kings did not ask the gods to change reality according to personal desire. They prayed for harmony, for stability, for proper seasons, for successful harvests, for justice within the cities. Order remained the highest ideal. Chaos represented the greatest danger. Seen from this perspective, the question, who created the Anunnaki, becomes more profound than it first appears. It is not merely asking about genealogy. It is asking about the origin of order itself. If the Anunnaki inherited their authority, who established the system they inherited? If cosmic law already existed, where did that law originate? And if every generation of gods emerged from an earlier one, does the chain continue forever? Or does it eventually reach a beginning beyond all memory? Ancient Mesopotamian texts never provide a final answer. Instead, they invite reflection. The oldest scribes seemed remarkably comfortable leaving certain mysteries unresolved. Perhaps they understood something that modern societies often forget. Not every important question exists to receive a complete answer. Some questions exist because they continually expand the limits of human understanding. For nearly 5,000 years, scholars, priests, philosophers, archaeologists, and curious readers have returned to these same ancient tablets, searching for certainty. Instead, they usually discover something even more valuable: perspective. The Anunnaki, once imagined as the highest beings in existence, slowly become part of a much grander story. A story whose true beginning retreats farther away every time we believe we have finally reached it. And perhaps that endless horizon is itself the oldest secret the ancient world ever preserved. After following the oldest surviving traditions across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond, we arrive at a realization that would have seemed perfectly natural to an ancient scribe, yet feels almost revolutionary to many modern readers. The Anunnaki were never the beginning. They belonged to a chain of inheritance, a chain of authority, a chain that reached backward into a past so distant that even the oldest surviving myths spoke of it only in symbols. But once we accept that possibility, another question quietly emerges. Was there ever a first beginning at all? Or had existence always been unfolding through endless cycles? Unlike many later religious traditions, Mesopotamian cosmology rarely insists upon an absolute starting point. Instead, it often describes reality as something that moves through stages. Waters give rise to heaven and earth. Heaven and earth give rise to divine generations. Divine generations establish order. Order allows civilization to flourish. Each stage depends upon the one before it. Nothing appears in isolation. This way of thinking has fascinated philosophers for thousands of years because it resembles one of humanity's oldest intellectual questions. Can every cause itself have a cause? Imagine standing beside an endless line of falling dominoes. Every domino falls because another struck it. Eventually, you begin asking the obvious question. Which domino fell first? Ancient Mesopotamian mythology never answers with complete certainty. Instead, it gradually leads the listener towards something even deeper. Perhaps the search for a first domino misunderstands reality itself. Some scholars have suggested that the earliest priests were less interested in identifying the very first cause than in understanding how order continues to exist. Their rituals reflected maintenance rather than origin. Temples renewed balance. Festivals renewed kingship. Sacred ceremonies renewed harmony between heaven and earth. Creation was not viewed as a completed event locked forever in the past. It remained an ongoing process. Every sunrise reaffirmed it. Every successful harvest renewed it. Every generation inherited the responsibility to preserve it. This perspective makes the Anunnaki appear in a very different light. They become guardians of continuity, not inventors of existence, but caretakers of an already existing cosmic structure. Interestingly, this same pattern appears far beyond Mesopotamia. Centuries later, Greek philosophers began asking similar questions using different language. Rather than describing divine genealogies alone, thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle searched for the underlying principles behind reality itself. What gives order to existence? Why does the universe behave consistently? Although their answers differed from Mesopotamian mythology, the question remained remarkably familiar. Likewise, ancient Indian philosophy explored ideas of eternal cycles in which universes arise, endure, dissolve, and emerge again over unimaginable spans of time. Creation was not necessarily unique. It could be rhythmic, cyclical, endless. Even some modern scientific models have occasionally explored similar possibilities. Certain cosmological theories have proposed oscillating universes, cyclic expansion, or realities emerging from earlier cosmic conditions. These ideas remain speculative and are not established scientific conclusions. Yet it is remarkable that humanity continues asking variations of the same question first preserved on clay tablets thousands of years ago. What came before the beginning? Perhaps every civilization eventually reaches the same horizon, a place where certainty fades and curiosity becomes more valuable than absolute answers. The Mesopotamians understood something that modern readers sometimes overlook. Myths were never intended to function like laboratory reports. They were intellectual maps. They guided people toward understanding rather than replacing understanding. Every symbol carried several meanings at once. Water represented both danger and life. Heaven represented both physical height and legitimate authority. Earth represented both fertile soil and stability. The Anunnaki represented both divine beings and the maintenance of cosmic order. Once viewed this way, the ancient texts reveal extraordinary sophistication. They are not primitive attempts at science, nor are they simple fairy tales. They are philosophical reflections expressed through narrative. This explains why they continue to inspire debate after nearly 5,000 years. Each generation discovers something different within them. An archaeologist sees historical evidence. A linguist notices forgotten meanings hidden inside ancient words. A philosopher encounters questions about existence itself. A believer finds spiritual symbolism. A skeptic finds humanity's earliest efforts to explain an uncertain world. The tablets remain unchanged. Only the readers change. Perhaps that is their greatest achievement. The oldest stories continue speaking because they never pretend to eliminate mystery. Instead, they preserve it. As we prepare to reach the end of our journey, one final realization begins to emerge. The forbidden secret, hidden above the Anunnaki, may never have been the identity of an even older race of gods. It may have been something far more profound. The realization that every answer opens another question. Every beginning reveals an earlier beginning. And the deepest mystery is not who created the Anunnaki, but whether the search for an ultimate creator can ever truly come to an end. As our journey through the oldest surviving myths comes to its end, we return to the same question with which we began. Who created the Anunnaki? After traveling through thousands of years of history, comparing broken clay tablets, ancient temples, forgotten cities, and the beliefs of civilizations separated by continents, the answer is both simpler and more mysterious than we might have expected. The oldest Mesopotamian texts never describe the Anunnaki as the first beings. They never stand outside creation itself. Instead, they belong to an ancient order that stretches backward into ever older generations. Those generations lead toward primordial realities, toward heaven and earth before separation, toward the endless waters, toward a condition beyond ordinary language. And then, the trail grows silent. For many people, silence feels disappointing. Ancient civilizations often understood it differently. Silence marked the boundary between what could be known and what could only be contemplated. The oldest priests were remarkably comfortable, admitting that some mysteries belonged beyond human understanding. Perhaps wisdom did not require possessing every answer. Perhaps wisdom meant recognizing where certainty ended. This humility may explain why Mesopotamian civilization endured intellectually for more than 3,000 years. Generation after generation copied the same tablets, repaired damaged hymns, preserved forgotten names, and maintained traditions whose original authors had been dead for centuries. Every scribe knew something extraordinary. He was not inventing the story. He was becoming another link in an endless chain of memory. That chain survives even today. The clay tablets resting inside museums are more than archaeological artifacts. They are voices, not perfect voices. Many speak through broken sentences. Others survive only as scattered fragments. Yet together, they preserve humanity's oldest surviving attempt to answer questions that still occupy us today. Where did order come from? Why does existence possess structure? What came before the world we know? And perhaps the deepest question of all, can the beginning itself ever truly be reached? Modern science continues searching for earlier moments in cosmic history. Powerful telescopes observe galaxies whose light has traveled for billions of years. Physicists explore the first fractions of a second after the Big Bang. New theories attempt to explain what, if anything, may have preceded it. The tools have changed dramatically since the days of clay tablets. The curiosity has not. In that sense, the ancient scribes and modern scientists share something profound. Both stand before an immense mystery. Both recognize that every discovery opens new questions. Neither possesses the final answer. Perhaps that continuity is the most remarkable inheritance of all. Not kingdoms, not temples, not empires. Curiosity. It has survived every civilization. The Sumerians disappeared. The Akkadian Empire faded. Babylon's walls crumbled. Assyria fell. Their languages ceased to be spoken. Their temples became ruins. Sand buried their cities for thousands of years. Yet the questions endured. When archaeologists uncovered those forgotten libraries beneath the earth, they did more than recover ancient texts. They reopened conversations interrupted for millennia. Across nearly 5,000 years, the voices of anonymous scribes reached into the modern world and quietly asked us to continue thinking, not to accept easy answers, not to fear uncertainty, but to keep searching. So, who created the Anunnaki? The oldest surviving evidence suggests they emerged from earlier generations of divine beings within Mesopotamian cosmology. Those earlier generations emerged from primordial realities symbolized by heaven, earth, and the cosmic waters. Beyond that point, the texts no longer speak with certainty. They speak through symbols, through poetry, through silence. And perhaps that silence is intentional, because every civilization eventually discovers that some horizons retreat as we approach them. The closer we move toward the first beginning, the more language itself begins to fail. Names become metaphors. Stories become philosophy. Philosophy becomes wonder. Maybe the forbidden secret above the Anunnaki was never hidden inside a lost tablet waiting to be discovered. Maybe it was hidden inside a simple realization. The greatest civilizations in history, the builders of the first cities, the inventors of writing, the observers of the stars, looked toward the beginning of existence and admitted that they did not know everything. There is something deeply comforting about that. It reminds us that mystery is not the enemy of knowledge. It is the reason knowledge exists. Every discovery begins with a question. Every generation inherits questions from those who came before. And perhaps, thousands of years from now, people will look back upon our own age in exactly the same way. They may possess answers we cannot imagine, or they may still be asking the same timeless question beneath another night sky. What came before the beginning? For now, the oldest clay tablets offer only a quiet invitation. Keep wondering, keep exploring, and remember that some of the greatest mysteries in history have survived precisely because they were never meant to be completely solved. As the ancient rivers of Mesopotamia continue their slow journey toward the sea, and the stars move silently across the night above them, the oldest question humanity ever asked remains patiently waiting, not demanding belief, only curiosity. And perhaps that has always been enough.